Welcome, and thank you for tuning in. I'm Lynn Berger, host of Lynn Berger Interviews Remarkable People. Today, my guest is Sally Cook. Sally is a journalist and author of several children's, young adult, and adult books. Her first book was a New York Times bestseller, Another Season. Sally, we're going to talk more about your books later in the interview. I also want to say Sally is an exceptional human being. She's enthusiastic. It's a joy to know her, and I'm thrilled that I have this opportunity to interview you today. So Sally, thank you.
Well, I'm thrilled to have the opportunity to be with you, Lynn. Thank you.
Take me back to what it was like to grow up in the heart of the Blue Ridge Mountains, and who were your greatest influences?
Oh, wow. That's a great question. Well, it was during the early 60s, and my parents were Northerners, and Roanoke, Virginia is very Southern. It's on the border of West Virginia. And my father worked for IBM, and he was a branch manager of the Office Products Division office there. So we were little kids, and there were four of us. And all of a sudden, we found ourselves in the South in segregated schools, which was very different than what we had been used to. So there was a lot of turmoil at that time in the early 60s with racial injustice and that kind of thing. So I think at that time I really admired my dad a lot because he kept his own opinions. He kept himself, he had very strong feelings about segregation and that kind of thing. And he expressed them well, and he was very well liked in the community. And I guess the other really big influence in my life was my second grade teacher. I had a wonderful second grade teacher named Mrs. Smith, and she really taught us the love of books. And she just loved her books, and she loved her students, and it was a wonderful second grade year where I really became a reader.
Wow. And you remember that so fondly.
So well, like it was yesterday.
And what about your family? Did they encourage you to read and write? And
I would say that my whole family is very interested in education. And, we, in those days, in the Blue Ridge Mountains, we had a gang of kids, and we were outside. When we got home from school, we dropped our books on the table. We went outside, we played in the woods, we made forts. We had all sorts of make-believe games. We were a big posse of kids. And then Mom would call us in for dinner, we'd have dinner, and we'd be right back outside until it got dark again. It was a very beautiful spot. We got beautiful snow in the winter because we were in the mountains. And I think that, our family didn't push us particularly, but I think books and talking about political events and talking about the day's news, we always had dinner together, and that was really important to have lots of discussions about things. And when we moved up from Roanoke to New York, my dad took me to the Metropolitan Museum often. His favorite places to take me were the Bronx Zoo, the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and Yankee Stadium.
Wow. Well, we're going to talk more about that sports influence later. Yeah. But it sounds so. Did you always want to be a writer as a career counselor?
Oh, yes. Well, of course, I'm always fascinated by what you do and working with people and helping them develop their true potentials, which is something I'm very interested in. I really think that after that second grade year and having Mrs. Smith, who really showed us the love of books, like it was Harry the Dirty Dog. I don't know if you remember that book, Lynn.
Yes.
But I loved that book so much. I used to sleep with it, and Curious George, all the Curious George books. And so anyway, I just really enjoyed reading so much that I thought maybe I could someday do this, but I was afraid to tell anybody because I thought I could never be a writer,
Well, look what happened. I hope this encourages some other people to take that seriously and to be able to verbalize it. So thank you for sharing that. So after childhood, you went to college. You want to tell us a little bit about what happened at Skidmore, I believe?
Right, I did. Again, our family had a big move because when I was in 5th grade, we moved from I was 4th grade. We moved from the South to the North. And the education system was different there. The attitudes about a lot of things were different. We were 45 minutes outside New York City. So I became very involved with the theater, and I did a lot of acting. And then when I was in high school, I became very involved with the school newspaper. And that was a big influence because, I had my own beat, and I went out and interviewed people, and I loved that. And then at Skidmore, I feel like I got a little sidetracked. I did study a lot of acting and that kind of thing, but I wasn't really sure, like a lot of college kids, what I wanted to do.
Mm-hmm.
So it wasn't until I moved to New York right after college that I got a job on a newspaper. It was a trade publication. It was the brother to Women's Wear Daily. It was called Daily News Record. And it was there that I was on the business side, and I loved the editors, and I thought, I want to be writing these stories. I want to be doing this. And so I started to do very small amounts of writing, sometimes just little essays for myself, and submitting them to local publications. And that's really how I got started writing, by submitting stories to, like New York Family Magazine. And I think I got paid $25 a story. And one day, an editor, she was a mom at the school where my children went. She had seen some of my articles, and she asked me if I would like to write for the Associated Press. She was just starting a
Wow.
couple of kids. So I was very excited, and I did that for about 5 years. That was in the early 90s. And I interviewed Meryl Streep, Jimmy Carter, Merle Haggard, Little Richard, all sorts of interesting people. And it was just an amazing time in my life. And I had 2 little kids and lived in New York City and was doing this job. I could do it out of my apartment. I filed a story a week.
Wow. Well, what I love about that is I always encourage people to just write. If you want to be a writer, write. And you see, and I also do have to give you credit for your fantastic personality. I'm not surprised that a networking event that led from a networking event or knowing someone just casually. But I think it's really important that people recognize if you want to be a writer, write. There's nothing, it's one of those things you can do.
I could not agree with you more. And that's what I tell everybody. I mean, I think a lot of people go to journalism school, or they think there's some training that you need. And you're a great writer, Lynn. So you know that you wrote your books because you just sat down and did it. And I think that it's a lot of self-discipline. For me, honestly, I think good readers make good writers. And I try to, when I'm writing a lot, I try to read a lot. I think that's very helpful in the writing process.
So I want to hear about what was your most memorable interview? You interviewed such interesting people.
Wow. Well, I have to say, I think interviewing Meryl Streep was pretty fun.
Tell me.
That was
Tell us.
really, really exciting. Actually, it's kind of a great story because during that was actually for a magazine. It was for Family Circle.
Mhm.
And she was really quite outspoken about the pesticides in the apples. I don't know if you remember this in the early 90s. She started a group called Mothers and Others. And she was really getting into environmental things. She had young children, and she was worried about the fact that we're using so many pesticides on the apples. It was controversial. But anyway, I was able to interview her for this story through a friend of mine who worked at NRDC, Natural Resource Defense Council. And I was to go to Meryl's house to do the interview. And I found I was pregnant at the time. I just newly pregnant. And I was very, very sick. And so I had called the editor and I said, I can't make it to Meryl's house. And the editor said, I'm going to take the story away from you then and give it to somebody else. So I was pretty crushed because it was really my first big interview. So I called Meryl up and I said, I'm sorry, but I'm not going to be able to interview you. And, the editor's going to give it to somebody else, the assignment to someone else. She said, no, I promised you the interview and I will wait for you. I will come into New York when you're ready.
Wow.
And I really liked her a lot. She was just passionate about the planet, the environment. She was really down to earth. And I felt like I really learned a lot from her. So that was a great interview. And of course, I interviewed Jimmy Carter too, which was also right up there as a wonderful afternoon with him.
Oh, tell us about that.
Well, he had just written a book about conflict resolution for teens. It's called Talking Peace. It's a great book. And he was at Barnes and Noble signing books. So the publicist brought me in and we went to a back room and we had lunch together, just the two of us, just Jimmy Carter and me. This was 1992. And he was so humble. I guess I was just struck by, I can't believe this man was the president of the United States. He seemed like just a really nice man.
Mm.
And he also was very passionate. I think passion's an interesting word because he really, and I think people know this about him, he believes in people getting along, making good things together. And he was talking about there doesn't have to be this conflict in the world, and it starts out on a very small scale. And
Mm.
that's why he wrote this book for teens, you know, to help them even with their smallest disagreements with other teens and that kind of thing. So it was a true pleasure. Then a month later, I ended up with the Associated Press interviewing Rosalind Carter, and she was equally wonderful.
Well, it sounds like you've had such wonderful experiences. And you used the word passion before, and I want to talk a little bit more about some of your passions besides writing. I believe sports was a passion or
Yes,
is a
I grew up
passion.
as a competitive swimmer, and I absolutely love to swim still.
Mhm.
I'm not very fast anymore, but and I do lake swimming, mostly endurance swimming. But in the spring and summer, I never miss going out to the lake and swimming. So I'd say swimming is one of my number one passions.
Mhm.
I love art. I wish I could
Mhm.
paint, but I really like just to go to museums a lot, and I like
Mhm.
to follow art trends, and I read a lot about art. And I really am very passionate about reading also, and almost anything. I mean, I like journalism, but I also love reading. I like reading kids' books a lot. That's a guilty pleasure.
Mm. Oh, I want to hear more about that because we're going to now talk about some of those delicious books you wrote.
Oh,
And, from what I can see is you have a tremendous ability to tell stories. I see your love of words and your passion for sports all come together. So I want to spend some time talking about how that all happened for you, the transition to becoming the author. And then we're going to talk a little bit about some of those books in particular. So what
oh,
about starting with the transition to becoming an author?
yeah. Well, I think sometimes I thought about this. I mean, I think we're always still the kid we were, you know. And so when you think about what you loved to do when you were little, you probably still love to do that. So I like to go outside and play with my friends and run all around and make up games like rough and tumble where we were throwing each other on the ground and stuff like that. But also, you know, I loved, as I said, all sports, and I loved baseball. I was on a softball team. So when my first book came out, actually, it really was a very sweet story, for a father-son story about a father embracing something that wasn't really popular at the time, or you know, he went off, he did something that was unusual. He didn't go with the tide, and I think I'm interested in stories where somebody just takes a step and does what they think is right, not what everybody else
Mhm.
thinks is right. So he raised his son. He did not put him in an institution. A lot of his friends told him to, because this boy was born in the 60s, and uh, I got to know the son very, very well. So I love stories of people, bucking the tide. So that was the first, and then it was a hard book to write. I collaborated with the coach. So it was 5 years of going down to Alabama. My kids were little. So I came back and I said, I'm not writing any more long books. And I wrote a 90-word picture book called Goodnight Pillow Fight, which is about a city full of kids who don't want to go to sleep. And it's about as different as the first book. So I can't say that any two books of mine are too much alike, but I think that drew on the fact that my kids wouldn't go to sleep at night. And I'm sure you know about
Yes,
that, Lynn.
any parent can understand that, right?
I said, we had two cats and a dog. They would go to sleep, but my kids wouldn't.
Mm.
And then I went to Yankee Stadium with my then agent, and we watched a great game. And I remembered going to the stadium with Dad, and she suggested to me, she said, why don't you write a book about how teams got their names? And I started doing more research and realizing, no, this isn't it's a book about how the game has changed so much in the 150 plus years that it's been in existence. So the book is really a funny story. I love humor too. It's a funny story of how the game of baseball has changed over the years. And I was incredibly lucky to be teamed up with Ross McDonald. We've done 6 books together,
Wow.
and he does a lot of work for the New York Times, and he's just the most fun person to collaborate with. He has a fantastic imagination. So that was great fun. It was called Hey Bada Bada Swing, The Wild Old Days
See
of
it.
Baseball.
It's right
Yeah,
behind you. Yes.
yeah, exactly. This is it.
Yeah.
So then what happened is we have these slang terms in that book, like belly whopper is somebody who slides in base on their stomach. Hot corner is third base. Frozen rope is a line drive. So those were in the margins of this book, and people just love these slang terms, and they didn't know about them too much, even though the announcers use them. So what we decided to do is make a whole book of slang terms, how to speak baseball, and it's all the cool terms. Baseball has the most slang terms of any sport. It has over 5,000 slang terms. But then it did so well that we decided to do one on football, golf, and soccer. So that was really fun. Ross and I created this How to Speak Sports series.
Wow.
So that was very light and fun. And it's kind of a funny history of each sport too, and some zany, a lot of these sports have their own hilarious stories. And then I got involved with this guy who I was working at a nonprofit. Do you want me to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah. And I also wanted to hear about some of the art in your books.
Oh, the art. Well,
Yes.
actually, I mean, the art in this book is just the most beautiful art. And actually, Ross came up with that title, Hey
Right.
Bada Bada Swing, The Wild Old Days of Baseball. Um, he has letter press from turn of the century. He has this old letter press, and it's really fun to go to his studio in Newtown, Connecticut, and see it. So he really, he's a real true collaborator. And when we're working on something, we will talk on the phone for hours, and we'll make each other laugh, because I really think that kids love to laugh, and I love to laugh. And it's so much fun to bring out. Who would think that baseball's funny? But there's a lot of funny baseball stories. There are a lot of funny stories everywhere you turn. So that was just, it's been wonderful. Ross and I are actually working on a book right now together. The other phenomenal illustrator who lives in Carnegie Hill
Mhm.
is Laura Cornell, and I waited 5 years for her to do this book. But
Wow.
her work is absolutely fantastic. And our kids went to school together, and she read the manuscript and she liked it, but she was doing Jamie Lee Curtis's books at the time. So I said, I'll wait for you. So I would love to do another book with Laura someday. She was a gem to work with, and her work is really, really funny and lighthearted and just what kids love.
Well, when we were speaking before the interview, I love when you said good words and good art make a great marriage.
Yeah, and I think one of the things is, like, when I wrote this Goodnight Pillow Fight, truth be told, this was a gift from somewhere, because it only took me 20 minutes to write this book. It's
Oh,
never
wow.
happened since. I tried for 3 years after that to replicate it, and it didn't work. It was just a gift, I think. So my words were on the paper, but then when Laura decided to illustrate it, she also creates a narrative with her art. And I think that's what illustrators do. So that if you have the marriage of good words and good pictures, you've got the perfect picture book.
Well, they're beautiful, I have to say, and very well written. Now, I know you're such a busy woman, yet you still have time to volunteer. So you want to tell us a little bit about what you do as a volunteer?
Well, thank you for giving me credit on that. I was an employee of a nonprofit called Project Sunshine, and I started their book club. What I realized is that authors were going into schools and libraries, but they weren't going into hospitals. And here is a ready audience, kids thirsty for this. When I first started doing that job, where we go in and we'd bring authors and illustrators, I'd bring a lot of my friends who are authors and illustrators into the hospitals. What I realized is a lot of the children were watching daytime TV and just bored, and they were scared. They were about to have a medical procedure or whatever. So we'd bring in the author and illustrator, and they'd bring their original art, and they'd read to the kids, and it was absolutely wonderful. So I left there in 2019. I had been there 11 years, but I still do volunteer shows at Mount Sinai. Mount Sinai Hospital has a closed circuit television station,
Mhm.
and it's state of the art. I mean, every hospital should have something like this. So you're actually on a TV station, and I do baseball trivia shows. I help them bring in authors and illustrators, and now I volunteer. I've also, one thing I should mention is I had the incredible good fortune to meet Sonia Manzano, who was Maria on Sesame Street in about 2007. We were at a book signing together. She writes children's books too.
Mhm. Mhm.
And I told her I was starting this book club at bringing authors and illustrators into hospitals. She readily volunteered, and she brought the entire Sesame Street
Oh,
cast.
good. Wow, that's
So for
great.
11 years, every December, I brought the Sesame Street cast into Mount Sinai, and they sang holiday songs. It's so moving, and we would be in the studio, and they got me to sing. They got my son Alex to sing and play the guitar, and it was just amazing. And we couldn't do it this year because of COVID, and I got so many beautiful notes from people saying we miss it so much. So that's something I'm going to really look forward to when we can do that again.
Well, that brings me to my next points. Being inside so much and, how we are in our homes. How has that affected your work?
Well, Lynn, I think that, this has been a really interesting year for the whole world.
Mhm.
And it's almost like I was thinking today, it's kind of like we're all on this forced meditation retreat for a year. And I was talking to a friend this morning um, during my walk in the park, and we were saying, we've learned so much about ourselves and what makes us happy and what makes us sad and how we relate to others in the world. And, I don't think kindness has ever been more important.
Mhm.
Um, we have no idea, what other people are going through with this pandemic. It's very hard. And so I think we've all learned that we need to slow down a little bit more. And I think for my own work, I've
Mhm.
been reading more. I've been more careful reader. I think that I really am paying close attention to my work in a way that before I would be running around and going here and there. Well, as you know, we're not doing that anymore. So I feel like I'm becoming more of a perfectionist. I'm
Mm.
being more careful with my work. Um, and I think, lastly, I feel like in terms of the pandemic, I feel that my relationships with my family and friends has grown deeper.
Mm. So, what do you think you're going to take forward from this experience? Because hopefully things will change. What would
Yes.
you like to keep in your life?
I'd like to keep that sense of really concentrating on what you're doing and not running so much from one thing to another. And we're New Yorkers, so we're used to jumping on the subway and going here and going there, and that is fun. Actually, I love the subway and I love going from place to place, but it's also stressful to be on time and all of that. Since we don't have that in our life so much, I'd like to keep that sort of more zen experience, and to do things really, really well instead of running from one thing to another.
Okay, I'm going to remind you of that, Sally.
I know. That's the other thing is, honestly, I really want to keep in really good touch with my friends. Once we can see each other, I value my friendships and my family and my sisters and brothers and my cousins and so much. And I cannot wait just to sit and have a great conversation with them.
Okay. And I know you love New York. And what do you see? Where do you see New York going after all this? I know we spent a few minutes talking about it. I'd love to hear what you think.
Well, a year ago, the energy was so different here, and I think we were all very, very nervous. And then all those cafes started cropping up, and the spring and summer felt lighter. And I recently started riding the subway again.
Oh,
I feel that this is just such a dynamic city, and I know that something like 500,000 people have moved out, but I think that people will come back, and I think that it's I'm very, very hopeful that New York is going to come back just like it did after 9/11 with a resurgence and a new love. And I think like all in this together. And I think the creativity, just with those outdoor cafes, for instance, or
Right.
people getting new careers and figuring out how to work really well. I think I'm very optimistic about New York. Yeah, and I think for this city, this is a great walking city. We're not in cars, so we're naturally with other people. And I've spent some time in the country, and what I miss most is those little interactions where you see somebody on the street and you say, "Hey, how's your son doing?" Or, you
Mhm.
know, and I think that New York has that because we're walking everywhere. And to me, it's very exciting to be able to walk wherever you want to go, or just jump on the subway and be in another borough. And I do think the subway ridership is way up, I think.
I'd love to hear from you. Anything that you weren't able to share with us, or what's next?
Oh, thanks, Lynn. Well, I'm working on two nonfiction books right now, one for adults and one for possibly older kids. It might morph into one for adults. The second one is heavily illustrated, and Ross and I are doing it together.
Mm.
And the first one is a biography it's an authorized biography about um, a woman who was really a superstar in the 1950s, and she's been, I think, forgotten, and I'd like to bring her back to life. So I've been working on it for a year, and I'm not quite ready to talk about it. So next show, Lynn.
Next show, I want to hear everything about it. And anything else you'd like to share before we come to a close?
Well, I just feel, we were talking about the whole idea of encouraging people to write, and I think if anybody in the audience is interested in writing and wanting to write, now is a great time to do so. During this pandemic period, we have a little bit more time, and I would just encourage you to write. It doesn't have to be perfect. It's also cathartic to write. Uh, so I would say that. And I would also say that I'm very excited about your show, Lynn, and what you're bringing to the table. This is really terrific.
Well, I can't thank you enough. You are, as I said when we started, one of the most enthusiastic, energetic, creative, interesting person I know. So it was wonderful to have you on the show. And I want to thank everyone for listening. Thank you.